He married a 71-year-old millionaire for the money, but just 7 days later, one letter changed everything. You won't believe what she was hiding all along. The sky over Chicago hung low with gray clouds, casting a somber hue over the crowded city streets. A cold wind pushed through the alleys, rustling papers and the last withered leaves of autumn. Lincoln Hale stood alone on the sidewalk, facing the cracked glass window of a cheap diner, staring blankly at his own reflection. He looked like a man aged beyond his years. Dark circles under his eyes, thin frame hidden beneath a threadbare coat, and a hollow expression that only someone who'd lost hope could carry. At 24, Lincoln should have been preparing for his future, finishing law school, writing papers, dreaming of a legal career that could lift him out of poverty. But dreams had a way of dissolving in the face of reality. After his father died from a stroke 2 years ago, Lincoln was left with nothing but hospital debt and a grieving mother he could barely support. His scholarship covered only part of his tuition, and the rest he tried to make up by juggling 3 part-time jobs, none of which were enough. Every morning he woke up sore, hungry, and bitter, wondering if all the struggle was worth it. He delivered food by bike, scrubbed dishes in a greasy diner until 2 a.m., and cleaned toilets in a law firm that probably wouldn't hire him even if he graduated at the top of his class. But Lincoln kept going. He had to. He'd promised his mother he'd make it. One cold October evening, fate knocked, disguised in the form of Arlo Gaines, a charming bartender from one of Lincoln's side jobs. Arlo was tall, confident, always wearing a mischievous smile, and somehow always had access to exclusive circles. "You want to make $50 just for showing up?" Arlo had asked. "There's a private party tonight. Real classy folks. I need someone to help with coats and drinks, but they won't notice if you linger. Could be fun." Lincoln didn't hesitate. $50 was a week's worth of meals. That night, he stepped into the glittering world of wealth for the first time. The penthouse was unreal. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a skyline view, chandeliers that sparkled like frost, and people who spoke as if the world belonged to them. That's where he saw her, Evelyn Satterfield. She stood near the fireplace, a glass of aged sherry in hand, dressed in a deep blue velvet gown that matched the midnight sky outside. Her silver hair was swept elegantly into a chignon, and her eyes, sharp, clear, and strikingly blue, cut through the crowd with ease. People greeted her with polished smiles, but few lingered. There was something about her presence that demanded respect and kept people at a distance. Lincoln hadn't meant to stare, but she noticed him and smiled. Their conversation started with small talk, art, politics, the bitter wine selection. But then it turned. She asked him what he really wanted from life. No one had asked him that in years. Somehow, he told her everything: his father, his debt, his hunger, his anger. Evelyn listened, not out of pity, but interest, as if she saw something useful in him, something rare. They began meeting after that night. Coffee turned into dinner, discussions turned into companionship, and one afternoon over French toast and black coffee in her sunlit kitchen, she said the words that changed everything. "Marry me." Lincoln froze. What?" "I'll pay for your education, clear your debts. In exchange, you'll accompany me to social events, spend time with me, keep the whispers at bay. No intimacy, no obligations. Just a contract, a partnership. People will think what they want. I no longer care." He tried to laugh it off, but she was serious. Dead serious. That night, Lincoln lay in his small rented room, staring at the ceiling. A million thoughts raced through his head. Was it wrong? Dishonest? But then he remembered his mother's face when he sent home just $50 last month. He thought of the law school fees due in 2 weeks, the hunger, the humiliation. He said yes. Their wedding was quiet. A few close friends of Evelyn's, a notary and Arlo, grinning ear to ear in the corner. Lincoln wore a borrowed suit. Evelyn looked regal in a cream-colored dress. There was no kiss, just a signature, a photograph, and the kind of silence that comes with irreversible decisions. He moved into her lakefront mansion the next day. It was a different world. Art-covered walls, a grand piano no one played, and a housekeeper named Ruth, who looked at him with quiet suspicion. But Evelyn was kind. Gentle, even. Every morning she made him coffee and asked how class went. At night they read books in the library or watched black and white films in silence. On the 7th day, everything shifted. Lincoln returned home late, exhausted after an intense lecture. As he stepped into the marble-floored hallway, something caught his eye. A red envelope, large, heavy, laid out carefully on the side table beneath the mirror. His name was written on it in delicate, slanted script. To Lincoln. Do not open until you're ready for the truth. His heart pounded. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. He turned toward the grand staircase, but Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. The house was eerily quiet. He stared at the envelope again, the message echoing in his mind. The truth? What truth? And why now? He suddenly realized he didn't really know the woman he married. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't who she claimed to be. Lincoln stood motionless in the dimly lit hallway, the red envelope still trembling in his hand. The elegant cursive letters stared back at him like a quiet warning. Do not open until you're ready for the truth. The words gnawed at his chest, feeding a dread he couldn't explain. What truth could Evelyn possibly be hiding? She had been nothing but kind, distant perhaps, but never cruel. He had expected awkwardness in the arrangement, maybe loneliness, but not secrecy. He moved slowly to the living room, the grand chandelier casting fractured golden light across the polished floors. He sat down on the edge of the tufted leather couch, his fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. Everything in the room looked the same, yet suddenly unfamiliar, like he had stepped into a painting where something was just barely off. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he went looking for her. He checked the kitchen, empty, the music room, silent. The garden out back was cloaked in shadows and the faint scent of lavender, but there was no sign of Evelyn. Finally, he climbed the stairs to the master suite, where her door stood slightly ajar. He knocked gently. No answer. He pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp on her nightstand. The bed was perfectly made, untouched. A silk robe hung neatly on the back of a chair, and on the desk by the window, he noticed something odd. A small wooden box, open, filled with envelopes identical to the one he held. All red, all with the names. He stepped closer. Some were addressed to people he didn't recognize. To Alma, to Dr. Whitcomb, to Cassandra Moore. Each was written in the same graceful script, sealed with care. One was already open, its contents gone. Lincoln's pulse quickened. What was Evelyn doing with dozens of personal letters? He turned to leave, but just then, he heard the faint click of the front door downstairs. She was home. Lincoln hurried down the stairs, and there she was, standing in the foyer in a long charcoal coat, clutching a leather satchel. Her silver hair was pulled back, and her eyes looked sharper than usual, almost guarded. She noticed the envelope in his hand immediately. I see you found it, she said softly. I did, Lincoln replied. What is it, Evelyn? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped past him into the living room and slowly sat on the edge of the sofa, placing the satchel beside her. She looked smaller than usual, her age more apparent in the dim light. Lincoln remained standing, clutching the envelope like it might explode. I wrote that letter a long time ago, she said at last, but I never knew when the right moment would be. Until now. Lincoln's voice was barely a whisper. Oh, what's in it? She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. My truth. My past. Everything that matters. But that I didn't want to force on you too soon. Lincoln's mind raced. Was it some dark secret? A former life? A crime? A hidden family? Evelyn seemed to sense his spiral. She stood and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've shown me more kindness in 7 days than most people have in 70 years, Lincoln. But I've lived a very long life, and some things are not easy to explain. He looked down at the envelope, then back at her. Then tell me. Now. I want to hear it from you, not from a letter. She hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Come, she said, motioning toward the library. They walked side by side down the hallway, past priceless paintings and centuries-old furniture. Lincoln had walked this path dozens of times now. But tonight it felt different, charged with electricity, like every step might collapse the floor beneath them. Inside the library, the fire crackled low. Evelyn gestured to one of the velvet armchairs, and he sat. She remained standing, looking up at a faded portrait above the fireplace, an oil painting of a man with steel-gray eyes and a military uniform. My father, she said quietly, a man of power, respect, but no heart. She turned to him. When I was 16, I was supposed to marry a man twice my age. A business transaction, not a romance, but I ran away. I fled to Paris with a forged passport, changed my name, and worked as an assistant in an art gallery. Lincoln's eyes widened. You changed your name? Yes, she said. Back then, I wasn't Evelyn Satterfield. I was Rosamond Pierce. The name meant nothing to Lincoln, but the gravity of it clung in the air. I built myself from nothing, she continued. Then I met Hugo Satterfield, yes, the oil magnate. He thought I was mysterious and strong. We married, and he never asked questions. He died young. I inherited everything. Lincoln struggled to keep up. Why hide that from me? Because I didn't want your pity, or your judgment, or your curiosity. I've lived 3 lifetimes before you were even born. I've buried a husband, I've lost a child, I've been threatened, sued, blackmailed, and yet, she looked at him. You're the first man I've invited into my life not out of need, but choice. Lincoln swallowed hard. I don't care what your name used to be, he said, or who you were, but I do care about the fact that there's more you're not telling me. What are the letters? Who are they for? Evelyn paused. They're goodbye letters, she said. The silence was deafening. I was recently diagnosed with a degenerative condition. My memory is starting to fray at the edges. I wanted to settle things with people I've loved, people I've hurt, people I need to forgive or be forgiven by. Lincoln felt his heart drop. So, you're dying? She gave a small, sad smile. Aren't we all? But yes, perhaps sooner than expected. The envelope in his hand now felt impossibly heavy. Evelyn stepped closer, placed a hand over his. I didn't bring you into my life to carry my burdens, but I couldn't lie to you either. You deserve to know. Lincoln's throat tightened. He had come into this marriage expecting comfort, financial security, maybe even loneliness, but not this, not love, and certainly not loss. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time saw not the millionaire, not the woman he'd married, but the vulnerable soul beneath, one that had endured more than he could begin to understand. He nodded slowly. I'm not going anywhere. Evelyn blinked, surprised. You're not? No, he said, voice steadier now. Whatever's in that envelope, whatever comes next, I want to face it with you. And for the first time since they met, Evelyn Satterfield's eyes welled with tears. The following morning, Lincoln woke earlier than usual. Sunlight poured gently through the gauzy curtains of the guest bedroom, casting soft golden lines across the floor. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of Evelyn's confession from the night before. The truth still weighed heavily on his chest. Her hidden past, her old name, the sealed letters, and most of all the illness slowly beginning to unravel her memory. It wasn't the kind of burden he had ever expected when he signed the marriage papers just a week ago. He had entered this marriage for survival, not sentiment. But now, things were different. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, in the way he had spoken to her last night, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something tender. He showered quickly and made his way down to the kitchen, where the scent of cinnamon and brewed coffee lingered in the air. Evelyn stood at the marble island, dressed in a silk robe, gently stirring honey into her tea. She looked up and smiled as he entered. Good morning, husband, she said with soft irony. Morning, Lincoln replied with a smile of his own, though his voice betrayed a subtle tension. She gestured for him to sit. There were 2 plates already prepared, warm scones with butter and raspberry preserves, a wedge of sharp cheddar, and fresh orange slices. Evelyn had a way of elevating even the simplest meals into something elegant. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who had shared something significant. Finally, Evelyn placed her cup down and looked at him seriously. I have an appointment later this afternoon, she said. A specialist. I'd like you to come. Lincoln nodded. Of course. She seemed to study his face for a moment, as if measuring how deep his commitment truly ran. Then she rose from the table, her movements slower than usual, and disappeared down the hall. Later that day, they stepped into a sleek black town car. Evelyn's driver, an older gentleman named Roscoe, didn't ask questions. He greeted Lincoln with a polite nod, then drove them across the city to a private medical center, tucked behind a grove of bare trees. The waiting room was silent and beige, with abstract art on the walls, and the faint sound of classical music humming through ceiling speakers. Evelyn filled out a form with a trembling hand. Lincoln quietly took the pen from her and finished the paperwork. She didn't protest. When the nurse called her name, they both rose. The nurse glanced at Lincoln. Family? Husband, Evelyn said without hesitation. Inside the exam room, a young neurologist named Dr. Kaysen emerged with a clipboard and a kind expression. He explained things gently. Evelyn had early onset symptoms of frontotemporal dementia, a rare condition that first affected personality and behavior before memory and language. It was insidious, progressive. There was no cure. Lincoln felt his throat close up. Dr. Kaysen reviewed her recent scans. There was already some shrinkage in the frontal lobe. It explained her brief moments of forgetfulness, her occasional mood swings. It would get worse. We're still early, the doctor said. There's time to make plans. There are therapies that can help slow progression, but we'll need to monitor her closely. Evelyn nodded calmly. I'm not afraid of dying, she said. I'm afraid of disappearing before I do. On the way home, Evelyn didn't speak. She stared out the window, one hand resting lightly on Lincoln's knee. He covered it with his own. Back at the mansion, the mood was subdued. Lincoln offered to make dinner, and for once, Evelyn allowed it. He prepared a simple pasta with garlic, olive oil, and roasted tomatoes, and she ate slowly, thoughtfully. After dinner, she led him to a room he hadn't seen before, a narrow, temperature-controlled space lined with shelves. My archives, she said. It was filled with boxes, journals, photographs, and artifacts from every chapter of her life. There were letters from Paris, sketches from her gallery days, a photo of her as a young woman in Rome, barefoot and laughing. And then on the highest shelf, she pulled down a locked box. She opened it with a small brass key. Inside was a single photo. A boy, no older than 10, standing on a dock with a fishing pole squinting against the sun. My son, she said, her voice cracked. Lincoln turned to her, startled. I had him when I was very young. Before Hugo, before any of the money, his name was Alder. I was barely 18 when he was born. His father left us, and I raised him alone for years. He was brilliant, wild, beautiful. What happened? Lincoln asked gently. He died, she said, voice barely audible. He was 16, a boating accident. I was working late. I should have been there. Tears slid down her cheeks. Lincoln didn't know what to say. He just stepped closer and held her. She didn't resist. For several minutes, they stood in silence in the archive room, surrounded by decades of her life, by stories too heavy for any one person to carry alone. That night, as they both retreated to their separate bedrooms, Lincoln sat at the edge of his bed, still holding the envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter, dated nearly 5 years ago. If you are reading this, it means I have trusted you with something I never thought I'd share. My name, my history, my failures, and my ghosts. This life has given me more than I ever imagined, and taken more than I could bear. I do not need your pity. I do not want your sorrow. I want your presence. If you are still here after reading this, then maybe I was right to believe in you. Evelyn Lincoln closed the letter, pressed it to his chest, and realized he didn't marry Evelyn for money. Not anymore. He was falling in love. A cold rain drizzled over Chicago the following morning, painting the mansion's windows with streaks of silver and turning the gardens outside into a blurred watercolor of dark earth and trembling autumn leaves. Lincoln stood at the window in his room, watching droplets trail down the glass as the letter he had read last night echoed through his thoughts like a whisper. He hadn't slept much. The image of Evelyn's son, Alder, his bright eyes forever frozen in a photograph, haunted him. He imagined Evelyn alone in some distant apartment, barely out of girlhood herself, holding a child in her arms and shouldering a future she hadn't asked for. And then, losing it all in one terrible moment. A moment that would go on to shape everything. He wasn't sure how to talk to her about it. Some griefs were so sacred they defied conversation. Still, he knew he couldn't go back to pretending. Things had changed. Their strange contract of convenience had given way to something far more fragile and far more real. He came down to breakfast to find Ruth, the housekeeper, setting the table. Ruth had been working for Evelyn for over a decade and always carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen everything and judged little. She gave Lincoln a brief glance, then gestured toward the dining room. She's out in the conservatory. Didn't eat anything. Maybe you could try, she said before returning to the kitchen. Lincoln nodded and took the tray himself, tea, toast, and fresh fruit. then made his way through the long hallway toward the glass-walled conservatory. Evelyn sat by the tall windows, wrapped in a cream shawl, a book in her lap she hadn't touched. Her expression was vacant, not from confusion, but from the kind of inward silence grief demands. She looked up as Lincoln entered, her eyes softening just slightly. "I brought you something?" he said gently, setting the tray down beside her. "Ah, thank you," she murmured. She picked up the teacup, but her hands trembled. Lincoln sat beside her and waited. Silence fell between them again, but this time it was shared. An unspoken truce between two people carrying too much. "I read your letter," Lincoln said finally, voice low. She looked over at him. "And?" He hesitated, then said, "It broke my heart, but it also made me admire you even more." Evelyn's gaze drifted back to the window. "I didn't want to die with everything hidden away in boxes. I thought, maybe someone should know the truth. Maybe someone should see me for who I really am before it's too late." "You're not dying yet," Lincoln said. "We still have time." She smiled weakly. "Time is slippery." After a long pause, she spoke again. "I've been thinking about the letters. I want to deliver them, one by one, while I still can. Some are for people who hurt me. Some are for people I hurt. Some are for people I loved but never told. If I don't do this now, I never will." Lincoln sat forward, surprised. "You want to find them? In person?" "Yes," she said with quiet certainty. "There are people scattered across the country. Former friends. A sister I haven't spoken to in 20 years. A man I should have married and didn't. I need closure before I start forgetting why I need it." Lincoln didn't speak for a moment. Then, with unwavering resolve, he said, "Then I'll come with you." Evelyn blinked. "You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted. "This isn't just your story anymore. You married me, remember?" A flicker of something passed through her eyes, gratitude, maybe even hope. She reached for his hand and held it, her fingers cool but steady. That afternoon, Lincoln began planning. He used his laptop to trace addresses, old records, legal documents, and alumni networks. Evelyn sat beside him for hours, rummaging through files and boxes. They created a list of names and cities. Some people had vanished, others had passed away, but a few were still out there. The first name was Beatrix Eldon, a woman Evelyn had once called her best friend. They had opened their first gallery together in the 60s. According to Evelyn, Beatrix had been bold, radical, and fiercely loyal, until one betrayal shattered it all. Evelyn never told Lincoln the full story, only that Beatrix had walked away when Evelyn needed her most. "She lives in Santa Fe now," Evelyn said, pointing at a photo of Beatrix in front of a sculpture garden. "If she'll see me." Lincoln booked the tickets that night. One way, no return date. They didn't know how long the journey would take or how many doors would be slammed in their faces. But they knew they had to start. As they packed the next day, Ruth pulled Lincoln aside in the hallway. Her eyes were sharp, almost accusing. "She's fragile," she said. "This won't be easy." "I know," Lincoln replied softly, "but she's not doing it alone." Ruth studied him for a moment, then gave a small approving nod. "She's not used to people staying. Make sure you do." Lincoln didn't answer, but he didn't have to. That night, as they loaded their bags into the car, Evelyn paused at the doorway. She turned back to look at her home, the mansion that had been both palace and prison. The rooms filled with echoes of a past that refused to rest. Her eyes lingered on the staircase, the chandelier, the portrait of Alder still hanging in the hallway. Then quietly, she whispered, "Goodbye, house." And they drove into the night. Two strangers bound by paper and chance, now united by something far more powerful: truth, forgiveness, and the beginnings of love. The drive to Santa Fe was long, stretching across endless roads that stitched together the heart of America. As the landscape shifted from the cold, steely gray of Illinois to the warmer, dusty browns of New Mexico, something inside Evelyn seemed to shift as well. Her posture straightened, her tone softened, and though the tired lines around her eyes remained, Lincoln noticed that she began to hum again. Soft, unfamiliar melodies that seemed plucked from an old world he would never know. They stayed in modest inns along the way. Evelyn, despite her wealth, insisted on simplicity. Places with cracked leather couches, creaky floors, and beds that smelled faintly of cedar. She said it reminded her of the early days, before the money, before the silence. Lincoln often caught her gazing out of windows, deep in thought, as if her mind was drifting not forward but backward through time. It was on the fifth night, while they were eating dinner in a quiet roadside diner outside Flagstaff, that Evelyn told him the story of Beatrix. She was my mirror once, Evelyn said, stirring her coffee. We met in New York in the early 60s. She was everything I wasn't. Reckless, wild, impossibly brilliant. We lived together in a studio that smelled of turpentine and cigarette smoke. We built our first gallery on borrowed money and audacity. Lincoln leaned in, captivated. No, what happened between you? Evelyn's hand tightened around her cup. I fell in love with someone we both admired, a sculptor named Julian. He was magnetic, dangerous. She warned me, said he was only with me to get close to investors. But I didn't listen. I thought she was jealous. She paused, a bitter smile curling her lips. She was right. He stole from me, left me in debt, and I blamed her for not stopping me harder. So you cut her out, Lincoln guessed. Evelyn nodded. I said things I regret, things that burned every bridge between us. She moved to New Mexico and never answered my letters again. The weight of that regret sat heavy in the silence between them. The next morning, they reached Santa Fe. The adobe houses glowed orange under the desert sun, their rounded edges soft against the dry horizon. Art galleries lined the plaza, spilling sculptures and paintings onto cobblestone streets. There was something sacred in the air, a stillness that seemed to honor both history and heartache. They found Beatrix's home just outside town, a weather-worn ranch house nestled behind a grove of juniper trees. It was simple but elegant, with wind chimes hanging from the porch and tall grasses swaying in the wind. Evelyn hesitated at the gate, one hand clutching the letter. You don't have to do this today, Lincoln offered gently. No, she said, her voice resolute. I do. They walked up the path together. Evelyn raised her trembling hand and knocked. Minutes passed. Then the door opened. Beatrix stood there, older, smaller than Evelyn remembered, but with the same piercing gray eyes that had once laughed beside her at gallery openings and cried beside her when dreams collapsed. Her silver hair was tied into a loose braid, and she wore a worn denim apron stained with clay. She froze when she saw Evelyn, her expression unreadable. Hello, Bea, Evelyn said softly. Beatrix didn't reply. I have something for you, Evelyn continued, holding out the letter. It's long overdue. Beatrix looked down at the envelope but didn't take it. Her eyes flicked to Lincoln, then back to Evelyn. I don't want your guilt, she said, her voice brittle. I know, Evelyn whispered, but I came to offer something else. Beatrix raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Truth, Evelyn said. And if there's still space for it, forgiveness. There was a long, terrible pause, the kind of pause that might have led to rejection. But then, unexpectedly, Beatrix stepped aside. Come in. I've got coffee on. Inside, the house was a sanctuary of art and age. Sculptures half-formed sat on tables. Canvases leaned against walls and shelves overflowed with journals and ceramics. The air smelled of linseed oil and firewood. It was a place of creation and of quiet exile. They sat together at a worn wooden table, and for the first time in over 4 decades, Evelyn and Beatrix talked. Not everything was mended that afternoon. There were wounds too deep, betrayals too raw to be instantly healed. But Evelyn read the letter aloud, her voice cracking, and when she finished, Beatrix reached across the table and touched her hand. I never stopped missing you, she said. Tears ran silently down Evelyn's cheeks. Later, as they walked back to their rented cottage, Lincoln said nothing. He didn't need to. Evelyn turned to him, her face wet with tears, but lit from within. One down, she said. He smiled. 7 more to go? She nodded. 7 more pieces of my soul to collect. And as the sun dipped behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in crimson and gold, Lincoln realized that this journey, this improbable road trip with a woman who had once been a stranger, was no longer just about closure. It was about redemption, for her, and maybe for him too. The desert wind howled softly outside the cottage that night, stirring sand across the windows and casting restless shadows along the adobe walls. Lincoln lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above him. He could hear Evelyn's soft breathing from the adjacent room, a rhythmic, almost childlike sound. For someone who had spent her life surrounded by people yet cloaked in loneliness, it seemed she was finally beginning to exhale. The encounter with Beatrix had changed something in her. Lincoln saw it clearly in the way she walked the next day, with less hesitation, less weight pressing on her shoulders. There was still sorrow, yes, but it had shifted from torment to reflection. She had touched a piece of her past and hadn't shattered from it. That realization gave her strength. After breakfast, simple toast and peach preserves eaten quietly beneath the warm morning sun, Evelyn brought out a new letter from the locked box she carried with her. She handed it to Lincoln without a word. The envelope was addressed to Thaddeus Klein. Old flame? Lincoln teased, trying to lighten the moment. Evelyn chuckled dryly. Something like that. She sat down across from him and rested her hands on the table, fingers gently interlocked. Thaddeus was the one person who saw me before I became who I am now. Before the money, before the reputation. He loved Rosamond Pierce, not Evelyn Satterfield. And I loved him back. But I chose ambition. I left him behind in Nashville because I wanted to be someone more than just a girl in love. He wrote to me every month for almost a year. I never replied. Lincoln felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It was a cruel irony. How often people ran from the very love they craved. And now? I want to tell him the truth, Evelyn said. I want to apologize. Not because I expect anything, but because I owe him closure. And maybe I need it too. By midday, they were on the road again, headed east toward Tennessee. The drive was long, winding through golden plains and rolling hills, each mile seeming to peel away another layer of Evelyn's carefully guarded exterior. She spoke more freely now, not just about the people in the letters, but about her fears. What if I forget your name one day? She asked quietly. Her eyes focused on the road ahead. Lincoln glanced over at her. Then I'll remind you every morning, and I'll make sure you fall in love with me again, every day. She didn't respond right away, but when she reached out and touched his hand, her grip was firm and grateful. They arrived in Nashville 2 days later. The city was bustling, alive with music and history, but Evelyn seemed distant as they approached the address they'd found for Thaddeus. It was a modest, 2-story house in a leafy residential neighborhood. Blue shutters, white porch swing, the kind of home where love might still linger. Evelyn clutched the letter in her lap. He might hate me, she murmured. Lincoln parked the car and turned to her. And then at least he'll know you were brave enough to face him. She stepped out slowly, every movement precise, as though each step carried decades of memory. They walked up the narrow path together. Evelyn knocked. The door opened. An older man stood in the doorway, tall, still broad-shouldered despite his age, with thick white hair and a face carved by time. His eyes, a sharp steel gray, widened when he saw her. "Rosamond?" he said, breathless. Evelyn froze. For a moment, she seemed fragile again, smaller, uncertain. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "It's me." Thaddeus didn't speak. He stepped outside, eyes locked on hers, and after a long silence, he laughed softly. "I thought I'd imagined you." She smiled through tears. "I thought I'd buried you." He looked at the envelope in her hand and stepped aside. "Come in." The interior of his home was warm and rustic. A guitar leaned against the wall, and a record player quietly spun blues in the background. Evelyn sat on a worn leather couch, and Thaddeus took the armchair opposite her. "I came to apologize," she began, voice trembling, "for leaving, for never writing back, for choosing a version of myself that didn't have room for you." He was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he said, "I was angry, for years, but I never stopped loving you." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. "I tried to forget you," Thaddeus continued, "but every time I played a certain song or saw a woman with your walk, it all came back. I kept a photograph of us, under that old oak tree by the river. Do you remember?" She nodded. "Of course I do." They spoke for hours, about what could have been, about who they became instead, about the cracks in time that swallowed youth and replaced it with reflection. There was no blame anymore, only memories wrapped in gentleness. Lincoln stayed outside for most of it, giving them privacy. He sat on the porch swing and watched the wind move through the trees, feeling oddly at peace. When Evelyn finally emerged, her cheeks were damp, but she looked renewed. "He forgave me," she said, barely above a whisper. "He said he never married. Said part of him was always waiting for me." Lincoln swallowed the lump in his throat. "Are you okay?" She nodded. "I didn't know I needed to hear that until I did." As they walked back to the car, Evelyn stopped suddenly and looked up at the stars just beginning to emerge. "I thought I was done with love," and she said, But now I wonder, is it ever too late? Lincoln turned to her. It's never too late, he said. That night, in a small inn off the highway, Evelyn kissed him for the first time. It was slow, hesitant at first, then full of something deeper than desire, full of permission, of letting go, of two souls recognizing each other at long last. When they fell asleep, her head resting against his chest, Lincoln realized the journey wasn't just about returning pieces of her heart. It was also about discovering the beating one still inside her. The next morning, the air outside the inn smelled of rain and wildflowers, as if the earth had taken a breath overnight. Lincoln awoke before the sun fully rose, the soft weight of Evelyn's head still resting on his shoulder. Her breath was slow and deep, and her hand gently clutched the fabric of his shirt, as though afraid he might disappear. He didn't move. He simply lay there, watching the dawn light paint the walls in quiet amber tones, and listened to the rhythm of a woman who had lived more lives than he could imagine, now sharing this strange, fragile one with him. When she stirred, she didn't open her eyes immediately. She merely whispered, "I remember the name of the perfume I wore the night I met Thaddeus." Lincoln smiled. That's a good sign. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Or maybe a final flare before the fade. Don't, he said gently. Let's just take today as it comes. After breakfast, they sat together on the bed as Evelyn opened the worn leather box once more. She pulled out another red envelope, this one slightly faded at the edges. The name written in flowing ink was Dr. Odell Whitcomb. Lincoln raised an eyebrow. Doctor? Psychiatrist? Evelyn replied, her voice low and tight. He helped me when I tried to end my life. The silence in the room thickened instantly. It was just after Alder died, she continued. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house like a ghost, and one morning, I walked into Lake Michigan in my nightgown. I didn't want to scream. I just wanted the water to erase me. Lincoln's heart clenched. But someone found you? Yes. A neighbor's dog barked until someone came. I was taken to a clinic where Dr. Whitcomb worked. He didn't treat me like I was broken. He treated me like I was grieving, angrily, violently, irrationally, but still human. She held the letter up to the light. I never thanked him properly, never told him what his quiet saved me from. I want to now. They located his name in an online directory. To their amazement, Dr. Odell Whitcomb, now in his 90s, was still alive, living in a small coastal town in Maine, retired, reclusive, and described by the local news as the man who listens to the ocean more than people these days. Lincoln booked the flights. Evelyn insisted on going despite the travel strain. She had started carrying a small leather-bound notebook, jotting things down, names, images, phrases, because her mind, she admitted, sometimes played tricks on her now. I don't want to forget what matters before I get to say it, she told him. The flight was bumpy. Evelyn slept most of the way, her head against the window, the letter clutched tightly in her lap. Lincoln never let go of her hand. They arrived in Camden, Maine, under a pale blue sky streaked with thin clouds. The town was charming, with lighthouses in the distance and clapboard houses that had withstood 100 winters. They found Dr. Whitcomb's address, nestled by a rocky shoreline. The house was modest, surrounded by wind-shaped trees and wild roses. When they knocked, the door opened slowly. A tall, thin man with white hair and thick glasses peered at them cautiously. Dr. Whitcomb? Evelyn asked softly. He squinted at her, then stepped back. I never forget a voice, why, he said. Rosamond Pierce. Evelyn blinked. You remember me? I remember all my ghosts, he said, then smiled faintly. Come in. Inside, the house was lined with bookshelves and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out to the roaring sea. There were no clocks. Only the tide kept time here. They sat around a fire, and Evelyn handed him the letter. You saved me, she said plainly. I've spent decades building an empire, but I never would have lived long enough to do so if not for you. I need you to know that. Dr. Whitcomb opened the letter and read it slowly, eyes scanning every word. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from feeling. When he finished, he folded the paper and looked at her. I always wondered what became of you. I hoped you'd found your way. I did, she whispered. Eventually. He leaned forward, eyes bright. The human mind is a wild forest. It lies, it protects, it devours, but it can also heal. You're proof of that. They spoke for hours, about grief, about healing, about how survival sometimes looked nothing like strength and everything like stillness. Evelyn cried openly, unashamed. For Alder. For the girl who walked into the lake. For all the versions of herself she had buried. Before they left, Dr. Whitcomb stood and took both of her hands in his. You were one of the few I never forgot. But now I can finally rest. Outside, the ocean thundered against the rocks. Unrelenting, eternal. That night, Lincoln and Evelyn stayed in a cottage on the cliffs. She sat on the porch wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the stars emerge over the water. He joined her and asked, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking, maybe I wasn't meant to leave something behind in this world," she said. "Maybe I was meant to carry something through it. Pain, memory, love. Maybe it's not about what we leave, but what we mend before we go." Lincoln nodded. "You've mended more in these past weeks than most people do in a lifetime." She reached for his hand again. "I'm scared, Lincoln," she admitted, "of forgetting you." "You won't," he said. "And if I do?" "Then I'll remind you," he replied. "Every day, every hour, if I have to." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Now you do that? I already am." And in that moment, bathed in moonlight and the roar of ancient tides, Evelyn understood that love wasn't something she had lost long ago. It had waited, patiently, in a quiet, persistent form she never expected, in him. The autumn air in Maine had begun to bite, the kind that carried whispers of approaching winter. The morning sky was soft gray, the sea outside their cottage restless under the clouds. Seagulls wheeled above the cliffs, crying into the wind as Evelyn stirred beneath the heavy quilt, her breath uneven. Lincoln sat at the small writing desk near the window, watching her as he wrote notes in the leather-bound notebook she now kept beside her bed. It had become their shared ritual. Each morning he recorded things she might forget. The name of the town, what they had eaten the night before, people they had seen, pieces of conversations, and sometimes just the way she smiled. She had asked him once, half in jest, "If I forget myself, will you write me back into who I was?" And now he was trying. That morning, something in Evelyn had shifted. She woke slower, and for the first time she looked at Lincoln with hesitation, like she was trying to place him in the right decade of her life. But then, just as quickly, clarity returned and she touched his face. "Still you," she said softly, her eyes wet. Lincoln helped her dress. Her movements were more fragile now, more cautious. The long hours of travel and emotion had taken their toll. But Evelyn insisted on finishing what she had started. They flew to Chicago again, where Evelyn wanted to visit one last person, someone she had never written a letter to, but whose presence lingered in every hallway of her lakefront mansion. Her sister, Gwendolyn Pierce. Lincoln had never heard her name before. Evelyn had kept it buried, perhaps too deep even for herself until now. "She was my mirror growing up," Evelyn said as they boarded the flight. "She raised me when our mother left. She gave me books, taught me how to thread a needle, how to defend myself. But after I changed my name, I stopped writing to her. I told myself it was protection. In truth, it was shame. I thought, if she saw who I had become, she'd call me a fraud. Or worse, she'd be right." Lincoln didn't speak. He only held her hand through the flight as she stared out the window, her reflection flickering against the clouds. When they landed, they didn't return to the mansion. Instead, they went directly to the address she had scribbled into her notebook, an assisted living home tucked away in a quiet Chicago suburb. The building was warm and smelled faintly of roses and lemon wax. Evelyn walked slowly through the front doors, her cane tapping steadily against the tile floor. She asked the receptionist for Gwendolyn and was led down a carpeted hallway to a sunroom filled with potted plants and soft music. Gwendolyn was seated in a recliner, wrapped in a wool blanket, knitting with slow, careful fingers. Her hair was white and cropped close to her scalp, and her eyes were cloudy, but the moment she saw Evelyn, her hands froze. "Rosie?" she said, voice thin but awed. Evelyn stepped forward, her face already breaking. "Yes, it's me." And then Gwendolyn began to cry. The reunion was quiet, the kind that happens when words are too old, too heavy, too tangled with time to be spoken easily. They sat side by side, fingers interlaced like they had been when they were children in the dark, hiding from their father's drunken rages. "I thought you were dead," Gwendolyn whispered, "yet I buried you 100 times." "I almost was," Evelyn replied, "and then I became someone else instead." They talked for hours. Evelyn told her everything, about Alder, about Hugo, about the letter she never wrote. Gwendolyn listened, nodded, and then said something Evelyn had not expected. "I always knew where you were," she said softly. "I saw your face in magazines, on gallery pamphlets. I knew who Evelyn Satterfield was. I just waited until you'd remember who Rosamond Pierce had left behind. Tears slipped down Evelyn's cheeks. I'm sorry it took me a lifetime, she whispered. Better than never, Gwendolyn replied, and squeezed her hand. After they said goodbye, Lincoln and Evelyn returned to the mansion for the first time in over a month. The house welcomed them with silence. The staff had kept it in order, but something about the space had changed. It felt less like a fortress and more like a memory now. Evelyn walked slowly through each room, touching the banister, running her fingers across the piano, standing for a long time before Alder's portrait. That night, she sat in the study while Lincoln lit a fire. I want to change my will, she said. Lincoln turned to her. Why? Because what I've built shouldn't go to people who only knew Evelyn Satterfield, she said. It should go to those who knew Rosamond, to people who loved me without condition. I want to create something that lives longer than me, a foundation for struggling artists, for young women who feel invisible, for those who don't think they're worth saving. Lincoln's chest tightened with pride. You've already saved so many. I want to save one more, she whispered. You. He walked over to her and knelt beside her chair. You already did. The following week, she saw her lawyer. She created the Rosamond Foundation, placed Lincoln as director, and established a full grant program. She signed the documents with a steady hand, her eyes clear and certain. Her memory began slipping faster after that. Some mornings, she forgot the name of the housekeeper. Some days, she called Lincoln Alder and broke down in tears when she realized what she had said. But he never left her side. He read to her. He wrote in the notebook. He played old records and walked with her through the garden, reminding her again and again who he was. One morning, while they were sitting on the balcony, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea, Evelyn turned to him and asked, Are we married? Lincoln smiled. Yes. Do I love you? Yes, he said. Very much. She looked at him, studying his face with wonder. Then, I'm the luckiest woman in the world. She passed away 1 year later, in her sleep, her hand in his. At her funeral, artists from around the world sent letters. Beatrix came and stood beside Gwendolyn. Dr. Whitcomb sent a handwritten eulogy that Lincoln read aloud. And Lincoln, once a poor student with no home, no family, and no future, stood in a tailored black suit, not as a widower lost in grief, but as a man reborn in love. He went on to run the Rosamond Foundation for the rest of his life. And every morning, for decades to come, he would open the old leather notebook and write her name, Evelyn Rosamond Beloved. So she'd never be forgotten, not by the world and not by him. As the author of this story, I believe the ending reflects something both rare and deeply human. The idea that love, redemption, and transformation can arrive at any stage of life, even when least expected. Evelyn's journey is not just a tale of aging or atonement. It's a profound testament to the power of truth, vulnerability, and second chances. What makes the ending powerful to me is its quiet heroism. Evelyn didn't conquer the world with her wealth. She conquered her own silence. She faced the ghosts of her past, not to escape them, but to make peace. And Lincoln, once lost in survival, found not just comfort in her presence, but a purpose far greater than he ever imagined. The tragedy of memory loss in the final chapter is deeply emotional, but it doesn't feel like defeat. Instead, it becomes a symbol. Even when memories fade, love can remain steady, carried by another, protected in words, preserved in intention. The foundation, the notebook, the morning rituals, all of these are acts of devotion. I wanted readers to feel that this story, though rooted in heartbreak and time, blooms into something quietly eternal. A reminder that it's never too late to say what must be said, to forgive, to be forgiven, and perhaps most importantly, to love completely even at the edge of memory.